the girl behind the hedge." The stocky man handed his coat and hat to the attendant and went through the foyer to the main lounge of the club. He stood in the doorway for a scant second, but in that time his eyes had seen all that was to be seen. The chess game beside the windows, the foursome at cards, and the lone man at the rear of the room sipping a drink. He crossed between the tables, nodding briefly to the card players, and went directly to the back of the room. The other man looked up from his drink with a smile. "Afternoon, Inspector. Sit down, drink, hello, dink, same as you were drinking." Almost languidly, the fellow made a motion with his hand. The waiter nodded and left. The inspector settled himself in his chair with a sigh. He was a big man, heavy without being given to fat. Only his high shoes proclaimed him for what he was. When he looked at Chester Duncan, he grimaced inwardly, envying him his poise and manner, yet not willing to trade him for anything. Here, he thought smugly, is a man who should have everything yet has nothing. True, he has money and position, but the finest of all things, a family life, was denied him. And with a brood of 5 in all stages of growth at home, the inspector felt that he had achieved his purpose in life. The drink came, and the inspector took his, sipping it gratefully. When he put it down, he said, "I came to thank you for that tip. You know, that was the first time I've ever played the market." "Glad to do it," Duncan said. His hands played with the glass, rolling it around in his palms. His eyebrows shot up suddenly, as though he was amused at something. "I suppose you heard all the ugly rumors." A flush reddened the inspector's face. In an offhand way, yes. Some of them were downright ugly. He sipped his drink again, and tapped a cigarette on the side table. "You know," he said, "if Walter Harrison's death hadn't been so definitely a suicide, you might be standing an investigation right now." Duncan smiled slowly. "Come now, Inspector. The market didn't budge until after his death, you know." "True enough. But rumor has it that you engineered it in some manner." He paused long enough to study Duncan's face. "Tell me, did you? Why should I incriminate myself? It's over and done with." Harrison leaped to his death from the window of a hotel room. The door was locked, and there was no possible way anyone could have gotten in that room to give him a push. "No, we're quite satisfied that it was suicide. And everybody that ever came in contact with Harrison agrees that he did the world a favor when he died. However, there's still some speculation about you having a hand in things. Tell me, Inspector, do you really think I had the courage or the brains to oppose a man like Harrison and force him to kill himself?" The inspector frowned, then nodded. "As a matter of fact, yes. You did profit by his death." "So did you," Duncan laughed. He was much too astute to remain in anyone's employ for long, and with the street talking about Harrison, the boy wonder of Wall Street, in every other breath, it was inevitable that he open up his own office. In a sense, we became competitors after that, but always friends. Pardon me, Inspector, let's say that I was his friend. He never was mine. His ruthlessness was appalling at times, but even then, he managed to charm his victims into accepting their lot with a smile. I for one know that he managed the market to make himself a cool million on a deal that left me gasping. More than once he almost cut the bottom out of my business, yet he was always in with a grin and a big hello the next day as if it had been only a tennis match he had won. If you'd followed his rise, then you were familiar with the social side of his life. Walter cut quite a swath for himself. Twice, he was almost killed by irate husbands, and if he had been, no jury on earth would have convicted his murderer. There was the time a young girl killed herself rather than let her parents know that she had been having an affair with Walter and had been trapped. He was very generous about it. He offered her money to travel, her choice of doctors, and anything she wanted, except his name for her child. No, he wasn't ready to give his name away then. That came a few weeks later. I was engaged to be married at the time. Adrienne was a girl I had loved from the moment I saw her, and there aren't words enough to tell how happy I was when she said she'd marry me. We spent most of our waking hours poring over plans for the future. We even selected a site for our house out on the island and began construction. We were timing the wedding to coincide with the completion of the house, and if ever I was a man living in a dream world, it was then. My happiness was complete, as was Adrienne's, or so I thought. Fortune seemed to favor me with more than one smile at the time. For some reason, my own career took a sudden spurt, and whatever I touched turned to gold, and in no time the street had taken to following me rather than Walter Harrison. Without realizing it, I turned several deals that had him on his knees, though I doubt if many ever realized it. Walter would never give up the amazing front he affected. At this point, Duncan paused to study his glass, his eyes narrowing. Inspector Early remained motionless, waiting for him to go on. Walter came to see me, Duncan said. It was a day I shall never forget. I had a dinner engagement with Adrienne and invited him along. Now I know that what he did was done out of sheer spite, nothing else. At first I believed that it was my fault, or hers, never giving Walter a thought. Forgive me if I pass over the details lightly, Inspector. They aren't very pleasant to recall. I had to sit there and watch Adrienne captivated by this charming rat to the point where I was merely a decoration in the chair opposite her. I had to see him join us day after day, night after night, then hear the rumors that they were seeing each other without me, then discover for myself that she was in love with him. Yes, it was quite an experience. I had the idea of killing them both, then killing myself. When I saw that that could never solve the problem, I gave it up. Adrienne came to me one night. She sat and told me how much she hated to hurt me, but she had fallen in love with Walter Harrison and wanted to marry him. What else was there to do? Naturally, I acted the part of a good loser and called off the engagement. They didn't wait long. A week later, they were married, and I was the laughingstock of the street. Perhaps time might have cured everything if things hadn't turned out the way they did. It wasn't very long afterwards that I learned of a break in their marriage. Word came that Adrienne had changed, and I knew for a fact that Walter was far from being true to her. You see, Now I realize the truth. Walter never loved her. He never loved anybody but himself. He married Adrienne because he wanted to hurt me more than anything else in the world. He hated me because I had something he lacked. Happiness. It was something he searched after desperately himself, and always found just out of reach. In December of that year, Adrienne took sick. She wasted away for a month and died. In the final moments, she called for me, asking me to forgive her. This much I learned from a servant of hers. Walter, by the way, was enjoying himself at a party when she died. He came home for the funeral and took off immediately for a sojourn in Florida with some attractive showgirl. God, how I hated that man. I used to dream of killing him. Do you know, if ever my mind drifted from the work I was doing, I always pictured myself standing over his corpse with a knife in my hand, laughing my head off. Every so often I would get word of Walter's various escapades, and they seemed to follow a definite pattern. I made it my business to learn more about him, and before long, I realized that Walter was almost frenzied in his search to find a woman he could really love. Since he was a fabulously wealthy man, he was always suspicious of a woman wanting him more than his wealth. And this very suspicion always was the thing that drove a woman away from him. It may seem strange to you, but regardless of my attitude, I saw him quite regularly. And equally strange, he never realized that I hated him so. He realized, of course, that he was far from popular in any quarter, but he never suspected me of anything else save a stupid idea of friendship. But having learned my lesson the hard way, he never got the chance to impose upon me again, though he never really had need to. It was a curious thing, the solution I saw to my problem. It had been there all the time. I was aware of it being there, yet using the circumstances never occurred to me until the day I was sitting on my veranda reading a memo from my office manager. The note stated that Walter had pulled another coup in the market and had the street rocking on its heels. It was one of those times when any variation in Wall Street reflected the economy of the country, and what he did was undermine the entire economic structure of the United States. It was with the greatest effort that we got back to normal without toppling, but in doing so a lot of places had to close up. Walter Harrison, however, had doubled the wealth he could never hope to spend anyway. As I said, I was sitting there reading the note when I saw her behind the window in the house across the way. The sun was streaming in, reflecting the gold in her hair, making a picture of beauty so exquisite as to be unbelievable. A servant came and brought her a tray, and as she sat down to lunch, I lost sight of her behind the hedges, and the thought came to me of how simple it would all be. I met Walter for lunch the next day. He was quite exuberant over his latest adventure, treating it like a joke. I said, "Say, you've never been out to my place on the island, have you?" He laughed, and I noticed a little guilt in his eyes. "To tell you the truth," he said, "I would have dropped in if you hadn't built the place for Adrienne. After all, don't be ridiculous, Walter. What's done is done. Look, until things get back to normal, how about staying with me a few days? You need a rest after your little deal." Fine, Duncan, fine. Any time you say. All right, I'll pick you up tonight. We had quite a ride out, stopping at a few places for drinks and hashing over the old days at school. At any other time I might have laughed, but all those reminiscences had taken on an unpleasant air. When we reached the house, I had a few friends in to meet the fabulous Walter Harrison, left him accepting their plaudits, and went to bed. We had breakfast on the veranda. Walter ate with relish, breathing deeply of the sea air with animal-like pleasure. At exactly 9 o'clock, the sunlight flashed off the windows of the house behind mine as the servant threw them open to the morning breeze. Then she was there. I waved and she waved back. Walter's had turned to look, and I heard his breath catch in his throat. She was lovely, her hair a golden cascade that tumbled around her shoulders. Her blouse was a radiant white that enhanced the swell of her breasts, a gleaming contrast to the smooth, tanned flesh of her shoulders. Walter looked like a man in a dream. "Lord, she's lovely," he said. "Who is she, Dunk?" I sipped my coffee. "A neighbor," I said lightly. Do you think I could get to meet her? Perhaps. She's quite young and just a little bit shy, and it would be better to have her see me with you a few times before introductions are in order." He sounded hoarse. His face had taken on an avid, hungry look. "Anything you say, but I have to meet her." He turned around with a grin. "By golly, I'll stay here until I do, too." We laughed over that, and went back to our cigarettes, but every so often I caught him glancing back toward the hedge with that desperate expression creasing his face. Being familiar with her schedule, I knew that we wouldn't see her again that day. But Walter knew nothing of this. He tried to keep away from the subject, yet it persisted in coming back. Finally he said, "Incidentally, just who is she?" "Her name is Evelyn Vaughn. Comes from quite a well-to-do family." "She here alone?" "No, besides the servants, she has a nurse and a doctor in attendance. She hasn't been quite well." "Hell, she looks the picture of health." "Oh, she is now," I agreed. I walked over and turned on the television, and we watched the fights. For the 6th time a call came in for Walter, but his reply was the same. He wasn't going back to New York. I felt the anticipation in his voice, knowing why he was staying, and had to concentrate on the screen to keep from smiling. Evelyn was there the next day and the next. Walter had taken to waving when I did, and when she waved back, his face seemed to light up until it looked almost boyish. The sun had tanned him nicely, and he pranced around like a colt, especially when she could see him. He pestered me with questions and received evasive answers. Somehow, he got the idea that his importance warranted a visit from the house across the way. When I told him that to Evelyn neither wealth nor position meant a thing, he looked at me sharply to see if I was telling the truth. To have become what he was, he had to be a good reader of faces, and he knew that it was the truth beyond the shadow of a doubt. So I sat there day after day watching Walter Harrison fall helplessly in love with a woman he hadn't met yet. He fell in love with the way she waved until each movement of her hand seemed to be for him alone. He fell in love with the luxuriant beauty of her body, letting his eyes follow her as she walked to the water from the house, aching to be close to her. She would turn sometimes and see us watching, and wave. At night he would stand by the window not hearing what I said, because he was watching her windows, hoping for just one glimpse of her, and often I would hear him repeating her name slowly, letting it roll off his tongue like a precious thing. It couldn't go on that way. I knew it, and he knew it. She had just come up from the beach, and the water glistened on her skin. She laughed at something the woman said, who was with her, and shook her head back so that her hair flowed down her back. Walter shouted and waved, and she laughed again, waving back. The wind brought her voice to him, and Walter stood there, his breath hot in my face. "Look here, Duncan, I'm going over and meet her. I can't stand this waiting. Good Lord, what does a guy have to go through to meet a woman? You've never had any trouble before, have you? Never like this," he said. "Usually they're dropping at my feet. I haven't changed, have I? There's nothing repulsive about me, is there?" I wanted to tell the truth, but I laughed instead. "You're the same as ever. It wouldn't surprise me if she was dying to meet you too. I can tell you this, she's never been outside as much as since you've been here." His eyes lit up boyishly. "Really, Denk? Do you think so?" "I think so. I can assure you of this too. If she does seem to like you, it's certainly for your sake alone." As crudely as the barb was placed, it went home. Walter never so much as glanced at me. He was lost in thought for a long time. Then, "I'm going over there now, Duncan. I'm crazy about that girl. By God, I'll marry her if it's the last thing I do. Don't spoil it, Walter. Tomorrow, I promise you, I'll go over with you." His eagerness was pathetic. I don't think he slept a wink that night. Long before breakfast, he was waiting for me on the veranda. We ate in silence, each minute an eternity for him. He turned repeatedly to look over the hedge, and I caught a flash of worry when she didn't appear. Tight little lines had appeared at the corner of his eyes, and he said, "Where is she, Dunk? She should be there by now, shouldn't she?" "I don't know," I said. "It does seem strange. Just a moment." I rang the bell on the table, and my housekeeper came to the door. "Have you seen the Vaughns, Martha?" I asked her. She nodded sagely. "Oh yes, sir. They left very early this morning to go back to the city." Walter turned to me. "Hell, well, she'll be back," I assured him. "Damn it, Denk, that isn't the point." He stood up and threw his napkin on the seat. "Can't you realize that I'm in love with the girl? I can't wait for her to get back." His face flushed with frustration. There was no anger, only the crazy hunger for the woman. I held back my smile. It happened. It happened the way I planned for it to happen. Walter Harrison had fallen so deeply in love, so truly in love that he couldn't control himself. I might have felt sorry for him at that moment if I hadn't asked him, "Walter, as I told you, I know very little about her, supposing she is already married." He answered my question with a nasty grimace. "Then she'll get a divorce if I have to break the guy in pieces. I'll break anything that stands in my way, Duncan. I'm going to have her if it's the last thing I do." He stalked off to his room. Later, I heard the car roar down the road. I let myself laugh then. I went back to New York and was there a week when my contacts told me of Walter's fruitless search. He used every means at his disposal, but he couldn't locate the girl. I gave him 7 days, exactly 7 days. You see, that 7th day was the anniversary of the date I introduced him to Adrienne. I'll never forget it. Wherever Walter is now, neither will he. When I called him, I was amazed at the change in his voice. He sounded weak and lost. We exchanged the usual formalities. Then I said, "Walter, have you found Evelyn yet?" He took a long time to answer. "No, she's disappeared completely." "Oh, I wouldn't say that," I said. "He didn't get it at first. It was almost too much to hope for." "You mean you know where she is?" "Exactly. Where, please, Dink? Where is she?" In a split second he became a vital being again. He was bursting with life and energy, demanding that I tell him. I laughed and told him to let me get a word in, and I would. The silence was ominous then. "She's not very far from here, Walter, in a small hotel right off 5th Avenue. I gave him the address and had hardly finished when I heard his phone slam against the desk. He was in such a hurry he hadn't bothered to hang up. Duncan stopped and drained his glass, then stared at it remorsefully. The inspector coughed lightly to attract his attention, his curiosity prompting him to speak. "He found her?" he asked eagerly. "Oh yes, he found her." He burst right in overall protests, expecting to sweep her off her feet. This time the inspector fidgeted nervously. "Well, go on." It was too much for the inspector. He leaned forward in his chair, his forehead knotted in a frown. "But what happened? Who was she? Damn it, Duncan." Duncan took a deep breath, then gulped the drink down. "Evelyn Vaughn was a hopeless imbecile," he said. "She had the beauty of a goddess and the mentality of a 2-year-old. They kept her well tended and dressed so she wouldn't be an object of curiosity. But the only habit she ever learned was to wave bye-bye.